Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about something I thought was interesting because a few years back I did a thing to where I maxed out every day, right? I did a training max, rotating lifts conjugate style, followed by large amounts of 10 plus rep sets. Okay, you guys remember that? And it was sometimes, I was averaging maybe 20 work sets every day. I did an upper lower. Uh, and I got pretty dang strong doing that, right? I mean, we deadlifted up in the 600s, hit a 350 something close grip bench, right? And I was also doing bizarre stuff at certain points. They were like, I'm just going to do pull ups every day on top of it, right? We did all sorts of stuff. Did all sorts of stuff like that. And essentially, I trained for hours every day. And that taught me a lot about overtraining. And again, when I look back, I made pretty decent gains during that time. It's just that the time commitment itself is ridiculous. And I think it started to become a problem at about 6 months. Right? Now, what was happening at that time, the only deloads I did kettlebell work and bands because I had a long distance relationship and I would go fly to see my girlfriend about every 7 weeks or so. So outside of that, I trained every single day. And then I just did light pump work while going to visit her for, about 5 days at a time. And then when I would get home, it would be right back to the rotation. But I did this for months. I did this for like half a year. And I got stronger. I got bigger. And that was the interesting thing, is when I look back in retrospect, look how long it took me to reach a state to where I saw signs of overtraining. And I think this says a lot about volume tolerance, depending on what you're doing with your life and your lifestyle and everything else. So again, it was fascinating. And in retrospect, I have to look at it and go, why did I run into problems? Was it the maxing all the time? I mean, keep in mind, guys, we were doing 7 training maxes a week. And they were hard stuff. It was doing squat and deadlift variations every other day. Some sort of press variation every other day. Floor presses, benching with different bars, bands, chains. All right? And we know that hitting maxes with bands and chains is harder because we end up with more peak load. So more total stress on the joints. And again, at that point, once I started reaching that condition, my strength regressed just a little bit. And when I look at some of this stuff, I realize that maybe some people's lifestyles need certain things in terms of training volumes. And I will be the first to say most of many of my clients only do 10 work sets a week. We do really hard sets per muscle group, 10 or 12. And we get good gains on that. But they've also got stressful lifestyles. But I think what this also points out is when you look at that, and we do have some of these volume studies that I am very, very reluctant to accept. Because again, the science isn't always good. Doing some of this junk volume and potentially making small amounts of more gains, very small amounts of additional gains from all this work. But we also look back historically at a lot of the really old school lifters used to train like that. Some of the golden era guys, they trained all the time, just at least small stuff. They weren't necessarily doing all the big lifts. And it does beg the question of, can we get away with doing these little smaller movements throughout the day? Can we do stuff all day long? Can we do mini workouts? Can we just get up and be extremely active with this stuff? And I think there's a degree of truth to that. And I think what gets people is trying to do too many big things or really heavy cheating or things that really beat you up, right? You can do a bunch of sets of little curls with light weight all the time. Right? And as long as you're not doing a bunch of cheat reps and goofball things that can inflame the tendons, can you get away with it? Will it possibly add a small amount of growth? Will it possibly improve body composition? If we're just up and moving and doing movements all the time. Okay? Maybe something to that. I think particularly when we start incorporating really high carb, lower fat diets and things, and since you're just burning through extra glucose, you're training extra glucose storage. Again, what's this going to potentially do for metabolic health? right? Just going to potentially be for conditioning. And stuff to think about, and I think with a lot of it, we look at some manual laborers and then people will point out, yeah, they're not always jacked, but because a lot of times they're doing lots of grip and forearm work. But, that's one of the things I noticed also, having been many years ago, worked as an industrial mechanic, which I'm not going to go into the details of all of how that worked. But there were guys who did it for a lifetime, and one of the things you noticed is that a lot of those guys, a lot of these guys work 60-hour weeks doing this. Moving parts, turning wrenches, all this stuff all day long. A lot of them had ridiculous grips and forearms. Even their hands were thick. These are guys who, we talk about grip strength, but they didn't get there from, doing just a heavy weight on grips. It was hours and hours every single day. And their forearms weren't necessarily overtrained. Most of them ate really bad. We're talking like, fried chicken and French fries and steak, and high sugary drinks all day long. This is how a lot of them ate. So they weren't necessarily lean, but a few of them were. Right, a few of them were. And some of the ones that were actually had reasonably good physiques. Now, a lot of us lifted weights and stuff also. But, again, just thoughts to think about. Here's what it comes down to. If you're eating enough and getting to sleep and rest, you can get away with a lot. And the only problem, and again, what I point out with a lot of it is the psychological impact and the time commitments. And then how do you structure and do certain things? In other words, if you're trying to come in and do too much heavy stuff that's beating your joints up, it's not going to work. But when you start looking at some of that stuff, even the manual labor type situations, or it's technically skilled labor in that case, but it's still a strong manual component, it really is a lot of volume. It is a lot of sub-failure volume. All right? But does it accrue tissue? And again, we come over to the point to some of the guys who weren't in surpluses and weren't fat looked pretty decent. So a couple of those guys I knew back in the day doing that, they looked just like plenty of the younger guys who were lower level bodybuilders at the gym who fancy themselves bodybuilders or aesthetic type guys. There were definitely some who looked like that. Okay, just pointing that out. And yet they didn't overtrain. And I think, again, a lot of it comes down to calorie intake, nutrition, sleep, and not pushing and destroying muscles when you're doing it, destroying tendons and joints. Okay, knowing your limits. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.